Welcome to episode 7 of The Culinary Citizen, a gastronomic guide to international relations. This is Sam Chappell-Sokol.
And Kelsey Marr. Each week we introduce you to a concept or theme connecting food and people around the world. This week we'd like to welcome Phil Champagne, former Director of Emerging Programs at International Alert and current Director at Three Faiths Forum. Hi, Phil.
Hi. Nice to be with you.
Welcome to the program, Phil. Thank you. As
Thanks.
Kelsey said, Phil is currently the director of the Three Faiths Forum, which is a British nonprofit that, quote-unquote, builds understanding and lasting relationships between people of all faiths and beliefs. They run education, engagement, and action programs that bring diverse communities together, mainly in the UK, but also internationally to create new models for intercultural cooperation in the EU, in the US, and in the Middle East. Until recently, Phil was working at International Alert, of course, international peace-building organization, where he was the director of emerging programs. In that capacity, he worked with food as a tool of conflict resolution, and now we hear that he has a new initiative going on in that space, and we're excited to learn more. So thank you so much for being with us, Phil.
My pleasure.
So first, Phil, can you tell us a little bit about why you're interested in food, using it in dialogue, and how do you weave it into your career?
Interesting question. Well, my career is in peace building and conflict resolution, and I think even now in my current role at the Three Faiths Forum, that's what we do. We work to bring people together to who may find it difficult to come together or to work through difficult issues and competing interests. And in my experience of peace building, going back about 20 years now, food has always been there or thereabouts in some capacity. And I've gradually come to the realization that it's an often unspoken tool with which people facilitate difficult conversations and engagement. And so during my work with International Alert, I became interested in that and gradually more interested, and then introduced this idea of the conflict cafe, which in fact was inspired by an initiative in the States, the conflict kitchen, which you no doubt know about. But I took inspiration for that and then started using food more deliberately, if you like, in terms of providing a space for people to come together. So that's really what happened and what led to the conflict cafe, which I introduced in my previous role at International Alert. That's really the kind of where I've got to, and now I'm working on a new initiative.
We'd love to hear about the new initiative, of course. I just have a question going back a minute. You said food is always in peace building. So I studied peace building and conflict resolution and international development. So I studied a lot of these things. I've been in some zones, and I'm sure you've been in more conflict zones. When you say food has always been there or thereabouts, what do you mean by that? Can you give us an on-the-ground perspective of what that actually means?
Yes, I suppose it's by that I mean that. For example, I've done a lot of work in the South Caucasus, and in Georgia and Abkhazia, there were many occasions where I would be introduced to groups of people in certain settings, and often that context involved a degree of hospitality and welcoming, and it was sort of ingrained in the culture, people's culture. So it didn't matter really who you were or if you were, friend or foe, as it were, but this kind of notion of culture, notion of hospitality was very much ingrained. And then that would lead to people sitting around a table and talking over food, and the food was seen as something that was introduced as a kind of symbolic, really, of hospitality and recognition of the importance of that conversation and that engagement. And I think those kind of encounters I came across a lot, where we were talking about difficult issues and people were trying to grapple with difficult issues, but food was often there, and we were sort of talking, or people were talking over a meal, or even a cup of tea. So it was that's what I mean by there or thereabouts. It was always, it was so often present, really.
I used to live in Georgia, and I'm wondering if you found the same hospitality in other regions of the South Caucasus.
Yes, certainly. I mean, in Georgia, well, in the South Caucasus, you clearly know about that. But the one thing really struck me is this kind of notion of toasting, and
Mm-hmm.
there's the kind of tamadar who's the head of the table, and then there's a lot of toasting goes on, which is a kind of affirmation of people's worth and underlines the kind of bonds between people. And of course, this relates to my new initiative actually, which is dealing more in food rituals. Rituals can be both positive and negative. You know, in Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example, I think also that hospitality was present. And in fact, one of the projects with International Alert it was to do with trying to heal or connect divided communities either side of the kind of Armenia-Turkey border, which is closed because of the standoff between Armenia and Turkey. And and food was used as a way of bringing those communities together. In fact, it was groups of women, and that initiative was very much building on that sort of ingrained, very traditional culture of hospitality and welcome that those women then used in their engagement with each other. So yes, I have come across it in many parts of the South Caucasus in different forms.
Dr. Johanna Mendelson mentioned that International Alert Project last week on our podcast. Can you give
Mm.
our listeners a little bit more information? She mentioned the groups of women too, but what were they doing?
Sure. Well, those groups of women, they were from two geographically very close villages, one Turkish, one Armenian, on either side of a border. But of course, they didn't have any contact because the border's closed. But going back centuries, they were from a kind of the same place, as it were. But they developed different languages, but they shared a lot of a cultural kind of affinity with food and with the local area. And so when they visited, International Alert arranged for them to connect. So they had to, drive a long way and sort of get access to each other's countries, of course. But when they did meet, they started a conversation, but they started it. I'll give you a practical example. The Turkish group visited the Armenian village, and the Armenian women acted as the hosts for the Turkish group to come in. And one of the women from Armenia used her house, so they congregated in this house, and the Armenian women then cooked a meal for the Turkish women as a way of welcome. A symbol of welcome. And during that process, one of the Turkish women then got inquisitive about what's happening in the kitchen. So she entered the kitchen, asked through translation whether she could help, washed her hands, and then began to help, and then recognized some of the herbs being used and sort of pointed out the similarities between some of the kind of ingredients that were being used and began that conversation. In fact, she said, the quote from her is, she said, once she put her hands in the flour, everything changed. There was a kind of affinity between the women, and you've got to understand that historically these women were from communities that thought the other was the enemy, and that they hadn't spoken for decades. And in fact, one of the key issues that their conflict is about is the recognition or not of the genocide of Armenian people at the hands of the Ottoman Turks, going back to 1915. So there's a strong kind of animosity between the two countries. So when they entered this kitchen and began to sort of engage and talk over food and recognize the kind of similar herbs and actually talking. And of course, when you're cooking, it's a bit like walking beside somebody. You don't necessarily look at that person in the eye, so you're not you can have a different type of conversation. In some ways, it's less threatening, and one thing led to the other, and eventually, after the meal and as they got talking, the Turkish women then one of the Turkish women said to the Armenian women, I know that you haven't been back to our country for ages, and we know that there's this issue of the genocide, and we're really sorry about that. So there was an apology as well in the conversation, that was the Turkish women really apologizing to the Armenian women about the genocide, which was 100 years ago, but it's still an issue there that is blocking kind of community relations. So this kind of initiative whereby the women cooked and shared their knowledge of food and herbs, and saw the similarities of some of the things that they did, and then began to talk, led to quite, well, I would say, a really significant thing, which is, I'm sorry for the genocide. That's a big thing to say if you're a Turkish person to an Armenian person. So that was really what the initiative was about. That gives a flavour anyway of it.
Yeah, I love that the story. I love that it wasn't necessarily planned that way, and it kind of came to be that way. And I also really like
Mm,
your image of cooking being like walking next to someone.
mm,
When I studied negotiation, one of the most powerful tools that I became aware of was, instead of sitting across the table from someone, that automatically means that you were facing off. That
mm,
it's a
mm,
zero sum game. You're at odds. Where as if you
mm,
sit at the same side of the table, you're looking at a project together. You're looking forward
mm,
together. You're looking into it in the same direction. So I can imagine two women kneading dough next to each other is very
mm.
different than a formal table situation in which you're sitting across the table from someone. It's a really nice image, and reaches much deeper meaning in a negotiation, mediation, peace building kind of context. So
Yeah, I think that's right. And Gulru Nabieva, who's the project officer at International Alert, who kind of coordinated this project, she said that food is a way of opening that space for more difficult conversations. So I think that notion of having a non-threatening, less immediately set up as a zero-sum kind of encounter, if you like, that can ease the way into what are fundamentally very difficult things to talk about. So yes, I agree. It's a kind of catalyst in a way like that.
You mentioned how in the Caucasus there is this ritual of being hospitable, but you also mentioned in your new project you're looking at how rituals can either be helpful or hindersome. Can you talk about how you're evaluating these rituals or even doing research on them?
Yes. Well, I've done some rituals on it. I mean, there's a ritual theorist called Ronald Grimes who says that rituals both empower and disempower groups. They attune and disattune, and they reinforce the status quo and enact transformation. So I think it's important to realize that when we're talking about rituals, there is often a conservatism in them that isn't necessarily aligned with transformation, which is what we're after in terms of peace building and conflict resolution. And that's why I mentioned the Tamada earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and this ritual of toasting. And of course, traditionally, the Tamada is always a man. The first toast is to women's beauty and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
it can be quite disempowering for women in the group. So there are kind of issues around the control and the power and where that sits in terms of the group. But having said that, I think, as Ronald Grimes says, rituals can also be a form of transformation, and that's what I'm interested in, is how these rituals can be transformative. And I have done a bit of research into this. And of course, ritual is a difficult word to kind of hold. It's, what is a ritual? So the first thing that I wanted to think, sort of get straight in my head was, well, how do you how do you know what a ritual is? What is ritualistic? And there's a peace building, a kind of academic peace builder called Lisa Schursch, who's written on ritual and peace building, and she comes up with sort of 4 criteria for rituals in a peace building transformative sense, and she's looking for situations in which there's a special space. The more special the space, the more likely it is that something will be ritualistic. And then secondly, it needs to be able to communicate emotion. So there's something about the communication of emotion. And thirdly, it's often symbolic. So there's a sort of power in ritual in its symbolism. And finally, it has this sort of socializing effect, this socializing and transformative effect in terms of people's relations. So I was interested to look at occasions where food is used within groups in ways which are symbolic, enable that communication of emotion. They're socializing in that they tie relationships and transform relationships, and that they are somehow framed in a special place. And of course, a lot of rituals in this sense and food are often, you often see them within faith-based ceremonies and so on. And the breaking of the bread, of course, is fundamental to this notion. So I came across, I looked for sort of examples of these rituals, and another example I came across, which you'll no doubt know about, is the ritual of sulh in the Middle East. And this word, which no doubt I haven't pronounced properly because I unfortunately I don't speak Arabic, but this ritual of sulh, it literally means peace. And in the Middle East, it has different forms, but essentially it uses food in a very kind of symbolic and I think socializing way on occasions where there has been a conflict between one family and another. For example, maybe a member of a family has stolen something from another family, or they may have killed somebody from another family, and the families then, and going back to the notion of hospitality and the value of hospitality, they see the need to mend the relationship between the families in order to maintain peace and stability in their community. So what happens if in this ritual is the family of the offender will the elder of that family will go as a sign of respect, and they will go to the family of the victim, and they will essentially ask for forgiveness. And the family of the victim, when the elder comes to them, they will, because hospitality again is so ingrained in the culture, they will offer them a cup of coffee. And the offender, the elder of the offender's family, will put that coffee down, and they will say that they won't drink the coffee until they have been given forgiveness by the victim's family. So the coffee sits there as a symbolic sign or waiting for the forgiveness and the reconciliation. And then there's a conversation, and often this conversation can be a long one. It involves a speech from the side of the elder of the offender's family, showing remorse, asking for forgiveness, and then a conversation about compensation and what form that compensation should come in, and so on. And eventually forgiveness is given and the coffee then is drunk. And after that, there is coffee is passed round, and it's passed around, interestingly, in a small cup and not filled up to the top, because if you fill it to the top, it's a sign that you're not generous. Interestingly, you have to show your generosity by filling the cup half and then refilling it when it's finished, so that you're demonstrating that you have a you can always refill the cup. And then when the person's having enough coffee to drink, they will shake the cup, and that's a sign that they've had enough. So that's another kind of symbolic way in which kind of the coffee is used. And then there will be a meal, and a special meal to mark the reconciliation. And this can either be cooked by the offender's family or the victim's family, is my understanding. And it's called mansaf. And this mansaf it's got lamb in it and yogurt, and it's got special ingredients. And in fact, this was one of the meals that was served in the Conflict Cafe that I mentioned at International Alert. So it's a special meal, and the two families then sit down and they eat together. And as they say, once you eat together, you cannot be enemies. So there's a lot of symbolism there, a lot of socializing influence of the meal. And the kitchen then, or the dining room, or wherever they have that meal, then becomes that special place. And through that, I can see how the notion of ritual then plays out with food in a way in which relationships that are broken between groups can then be mended, and that some degree of compensation and reparation and stability can then be reestablished between those families.
My mind is racing with all of the culinary rituals that I've heard in my years of reading and writing about this topic, and wondering which of these are either just ritual, ceremonial, traditional ceremony, versus trying to be transformational or transformative or could be used that way in a peace building space. So I'm excited to keep following your work and learning more about each of these rituals that you study, because I haven't heard much research in this space being done, and I think this is fascinating.
I mean, obviously, the notion of ritual is not new. You know, there's been a lot of study into ritual, but I think, and this, we're coming up to, for those of us in the Christian faith, we're coming up to Christmas, and there's going to be a lot of eating and symbolism, kind of traditional ritualistic type of meals around that, of course, celebratory. And I think that kind of points to the role of food in community resilience, in a way, in maintaining community relations between individuals and groups. And I think in our kind of modern society, I think that's breaking down a bit. I think this kind of idea of a family meal where on a Sunday where you kind of sit down and maybe you reaffirm each other, or you tell stories and you spend time, that's not so common anymore, but at least not in my family. And it's hard to get my kids to sit down at all, let alone on a sort of special Sunday meal. But I think this reflects there's a challenge within our modern society, I think, about trying to, and I think food, the way we use food in that sense as a sort of bond between people and communities and within families, I think we're struggling a bit to kind of keep hold of that. Mm-hmm. So what I'm interested in is bringing that back a bit and bringing the value of that into peace building work, and to sort of reinforce its importance. And I'm beginning to think of it more in terms of, because the difficulty, I think, is, and I'm sure this is the same in your work, is actually finding frameworks and ways of being more explicit about the value of food in peace building processes. Because we sort of, as I said, in my work it was always there, there was something that I was aware of, but I think it would help us to try and pinpoint more its specific value. And so looking through the lens of ritual is something that I'm finding a way of doing that, through looking through the lens of ritual, if you like.
Yeah, I think that, as you say, in all of this work, it's very difficult to find a framework, to find context. We know what is there. We know that this works. We know that food is always present in these spaces, but it's challenging to really identify which part of the presence of food can actually lead to any transformation in a peace building space. We spoke with a professor at American University, Professor Mendelsohn Foreman. She works with students to understand how food can be used as a tool to teach conflict in diaspora. So in her class, we visited restaurants of the Ethiopian community in Washington, D.C., Vietnamese community, Afghan community, and the El Salvadoran community, all of which have a large diaspora in the DC area. And I'm thinking a lot about how ritual in those resettled communities, and especially food ritual, can bring a community together, not in a peace-building capacity, but also in a building your own, building up a new life capacity. Like I know
Yes.
in DC, I attended the Ethiopian coffee ceremony many times. It's, of course, an Ethiopian traditional ritual, but now it's an American traditional ritual. It's part of the Ethiopian American diaspora in DC, and that's
Mm,
uh, a very a very powerful thing to have been brought from the old country to the new country. That's very grounding. So I think that's
mm,
a different way to look at ritual in this culinary
sure.
diplomacy type of conversation.
I would be interested in knowing, Phil, you're talking about how do we distill or which lenses we use to analyze food in the peace building context. How are you measuring your projects and the efficacy of them?
Mhm. Yeah, yes, that's a good question. Um,
Difficult.
I think it is difficult. I mean, I have to say that this work on ritual. I mean, my this project I've started with a few colleagues is called Kitchen Rituals, and we've done some research, but as yet, I mean, what we're interested in doing is gathering examples and information and doing sort of more, if you like, research into what's happening in terms of rituals and trying to build up a framework for understanding that. We're a long way, I think, from measuring its impact from the perspective of the rituals. I suppose. I mean, one of the another way in which I've begun to sort of categorize different types of food-based initiatives is really to look at the extent to which they are about justice or about good relations, and the extent to which they are either they are about ritual, or are they just about delivering food as a need. So I think one way that's probably not about impact. This is more about trying to clarify what we want to measure, because I think there's a lot of examples of food-based projects, for example, or there's a food justice movement working in the justice sector in prisons. So I'm sure you're aware about as well, where there's rights-based approaches to try and make the point that food is a right and you can't withhold that from prisoners or serve them kind of inferior food as a form of punishment because you're denying certain sort of basic human rights. So there's a lot of work that links food to that notion of justice. There's obviously food aid and the basic process of getting food to people, and there's food which is we have Jamie Oliver here who's set up his kind of 15, this kind of project 15, which is giving economic opportunity to young people to work in kitchens. So that's about sort of economic opportunity, but I'm trying to kind of discount that area of work and focus more on where food is used ritualistically to bring people together, and also where it's more about justice and good relations work. So I think the stage I'm at really is trying to more clarify what it is we want to measure rather than being able to measure it, if that makes any sense.
Right.
I don't think we're there yet.
I'm wondering if, with your work with International Alert, if there was any thought about that as well, about measuring or indicators for the success of one of those projects. Was there an eye to asking the chefs involved or interviewing the
Mm,
partygoers, people who came to these events, doing an exit interview and saying, how did your perceptions change? Or
mm,
are you going to go back to your own communities and talk about this project?
mm,
Or was there a mind to that? Or was it just so many projects that I've heard about?
mm.
The difficulty is just getting the project off the ground. And it's
Yeah.
step 2 or step 3 to start evaluating it. So has that been part of Alert's project, or is that still the next step?
Yeah, I think Alert are improving their and very conscious about developing their impact measurement. To be honest, I don't know. I mentioned the project officer Guru Nabieva who runs that. I think you'd have to ask her about the detail of impact measurement there, or the evaluation framework. My own kind of take on it is that I think often the most effective form of impact or measuring impact is to gather the stories. I think I told a bit of that story earlier on about the Armenian and Turkish women
Mm-hmm.
and what happened during the process. I think if you can gather those kind of stories, then you can measure that impact. I think in terms of what that is measuring, in terms of that story, I think what you're measuring is the ability of those two groups to have a conversation at all, after years of separation and animosity. You're also measuring things like, was there apology? If peace building is about people being able to express their remorse, their anger as well, being able to express their different emotions, and to get some recognition of that, and a view to getting apology and some recognition of yes, we understand where you're coming from, we understand your hurt and your pain. If it's about measuring those things, then I think that story that I told gives some insights into how that was beginning to happen. I think it's in that sense, it's quite quantitative, and I think it is about trying to tell that narrative, and to communicate that. Because I don't know what your view is of peace building yourselves, but I think often, in order to get into the kind of hard conversations and the negotiations of the settlement, if you like, you have to have that recognition of, from each side, recognizing the other, that we understand your grievance, if you like. We
Mm-hmm.
understand how you feel hurt. We understand that. And if that's not there, it's very hard to move on to any kind of conversation about, well, how do we draw up some kind of political settlement, or how do we develop some form of reparation, or so on. But you need that recognition, and I think that's what happened in that story, partly anyway, with those two groups of women. So that's not a very specific answer to your question about impact, but I think it's being able to be clear about what your indicators are, and whether they are about emotion, about forgiveness, those kind of things, or whether they're something else, and then being able to pull together stories that can shed light on those things.
That's as much as we can hope for. And you're right, that story that you told is exactly the outcome that any good peace building program could hope for, and wouldn't necessarily achieve every single time, but it's incredible that they've been able to do so.
There was another indicator that you might be interested in, or maybe you already know this, but there were two local organisations that were helping to facilitate this project. One Turkish, one Armenian, one from each. They met through the project and got married. So that was another indication.
There's another indicator, sure.
of impact, perhaps.
Sure.
So, what do you see with your research in kitchen rituals for the future of peace building with food?
I hope. I suppose I hope that what will develop, and in the field more broadly, and that's why it's good to talk to you and keep in touch with others, and why it's important to do the kind of thing you're doing in terms of gathering different examples. What I hope is that we will get a better understanding of the more specific role that food can play in processes of people trying to work through difficulties. By that I mean, I want to go beyond studying food as a way of understanding different cultures and different nations, different kind of traditions in a educational way, although that's important. And I think that's what Alert's Conflict Cafe did, really, because they were bringing people who were interested in food, the general public, together to raise their awareness about conflict through talking about the food from different places. And I suppose Pittsburgh, I mentioned the conflict kitchen in Pittsburgh. Again, that's a sort of, my understanding of that is a awareness raising, almost campaigning tool, which was conceptualized by artists, interestingly. My interest and my hope is that I think what we're lacking is a real grasp from a practitioner point of view of how to utilize food in real peace building contexts. I think that's a field that we're beginning to explore and unpack, but I think there's a lot of work still to do around that. And I think what's exciting is that I think there will be lots of different experiments and ideas that we'll try, but out of that experimenting will come a more rigorous knowledge of how, from a practitioner's point of view, how food should not be ignored. And the importance of that I can underline just from example from here in the UK, because my research also looked at the role of food in dealing with youth offending in the UK. And interestingly, a lot of people talk about restorative justice, and restorative justice is trying to, in a way, get a peace building feel to notions of justice, and that it's trying to kind of mend relationships between victims and offenders and so on. Interestingly, even those practitioners of restorative justice in this country, they're very unaware of the importance of just offering an offender a cup of tea. If you're trying to get a victim and offender to kind of talk to each other, it's quite telling that that food is absent. Even a cup of tea or a glass of water is absent, and we've sort of lost that understanding of the importance of food and gestures of offers of tea and so on as such an integral part of processes that are trying to mend relationships and deal with relationships. So I hope that we'll get a better understanding of that and be able to therefore use it more effectively in peace building processes.
Mm-hmm. To remember that these are people we're dealing with. It's all this is a humanity type of situation,
Exactly.
So
yeah.
Well, Phil, this has been fascinating. I want to learn more. I want to keep talking to you for hours. I also am curious how we can follow your work in the future, and our listeners, if they want to follow your work on kitchen rituals, follow the Three Faiths Forum and its work, how can people keep connected with you?
Well, we are in the process of putting up a Facebook page, hopefully soon, on a Kitchen Rituals Facebook page. So this is quite a new initiative, but I think that's the next step for us. So certainly, once that's up, I'll kind of signpost you to it, and perhaps your listeners could then visit and see what they think of it. But
Perfect.
We hope that Facebook page will be a way of just beginning to kind of develop the kind of context and network around this notion of kitchen rituals.
That would be great. Before we go, Phil, tell us your one universal truth about food.
My one universal truth about food. Everyone needs it. That's a bit of an obvious one, probably, but I don't know.
It's obvious, but it's also deep. I mean, everyone needs it, and whether you're in conflict situations or you're in a prison situation, it's easy to forget that we all need food. We all need that to survive, and it is vital. And when you're talking about food security, when you're talking about droughts, when you're talking about famines, it's obvious that food is lacking. But at base, we all need food. So I think that's a very important universal truth to always keep in mind. Well, Phil, thank you so much for chatting with us today. We are excited about your new initiative. We will definitely follow it, and we look forward to maybe having you back in 6 months or a year and hearing how it's going, hearing more research, and catching up. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and thank you for the opportunity. And I will definitely keep in touch.
Perfect. Thank you all for listening to The Culinary Citizen today. As always, you can connect with us on Facebook. We just launched our new logo, designed by a friend, Drew Carlisle. So check that out, Culinary Citizen at Facebook. You can also email us at theculinarycitizen@gmail.com if you have any questions, concerns, topics you want to address. If you want to be on the show, let us know. And until next week.